Hey guys, tonight we're exploring a story that everyone in history should know. The story is why pregnancy was so hard for 19th century women. You get comfortable, take a moment, like the video, and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Why pregnancy was so hard for 19th century women. Imagine waking before sunrise in a small 19th century home, while the world outside is still quiet. The air is cool, and somewhere beyond the walls, a horse moves slowly along a road. You can hear the faint sound of footsteps, perhaps a bucket being carried across a yard, perhaps the soft crackle of a fire being prepared for the morning. Inside, a woman lies awake. She is pregnant. There is nothing unusual about pregnancy itself. Women had been becoming pregnant for thousands of years. The body had not changed. The stages of pregnancy were still governed by the same natural processes that govern them today. But the world around pregnancy was very different. A 19th century woman could not rely on modern prenatal examinations, ultrasound images, antibiotics, safe blood transfusions, reliable anesthesia, or modern emergency obstetric surgery. Even when a doctor was available, medicine often had limited ways of understanding what was happening inside the pregnant body. Pregnancy could therefore be an ordinary part of family life, and, at the same time, a period of considerable uncertainty. For many women, the first difficulty began long before childbirth. It began with the simple fact that pregnancy could last for months, while remaining largely invisible to everyone except the woman herself. In the early weeks, she might feel tired. She might become unusually sensitive to certain smells. Food that had once seemed pleasant could suddenly become difficult to tolerate. The smell of cooking meat, smoke from a fireplace, damp clothing, or even a familiar perfume might turn her stomach. There were no home pregnancy tests. A woman generally had to interpret the changes in her own body. A missed menstrual period could be an important clue, but it was not absolute proof. Irregular cycles happened. Illness could change menstruation. Stress, poor nutrition, and other physical conditions could also affect the timing of a period. So a woman might spend days or weeks wondering. And while she waited for certainty, daily life continued. There were clothes to wash. Water had to be carried. Food had to be prepared. Children needed attention. Animals might need feeding. A household did not stop simply because one woman was pregnant. For women who worked in agriculture, domestic service, factories, shops, or family businesses, pregnancy often existed alongside physical labor. The exact experience varied enormously according to social class, occupation, region, age, and family circumstances. A wealthy woman might have servants who carried water, prepared meals, washed clothing, and helped with children. A poor woman might have had to continue doing much of this work herself. This difference matters. When we speak about 19th century pregnancy, there was no single experience shared by every woman. There were wealthy women and poor women, urban women and rural women, women who could afford physicians and women who could not, women surrounded by relatives and women who lived far from their families, women whose pregnancies were uncomplicated and women whose bodies struggled with conditions that could become dangerous. The century itself was also changing. The 19th century began in a world where medical knowledge was still heavily influenced by older traditions, and it ended in a world beginning to understand germs, antisepsis, anesthesia, and more systematic medical observation. The difference between 1800 and 1900 was enormous, yet progress did not arrive everywhere at once. A woman living in a large city near a hospital at the end of the century could encounter medical practices that would have seemed unfamiliar to a woman living in a rural village decades earlier. But even near the end of the century, childbirth remained physically demanding and sometimes dangerous. To understand why, it helps to begin with the months before labor. Imagine a woman several months into pregnancy. Her waist is gradually changing. Her center of gravity is shifting. The growing uterus is pressing against organs that have occupied the same space for most of her life. She may need to urinate more often. Her back may ache. Her sleep may become uncomfortable. She may experience heartburn, constipation, swelling, or shortness of breath. None of these experiences were unique to the 19th century. Modern pregnant women experience many of the same physical changes. The difference was that 19th century women had fewer ways to manage them. There were no modern pregnancy pillows designed to support the body. There were no standardized prenatal exercise programs. There was no widespread understanding of the nutritional requirements of pregnancy in the modern sense. There was also no routine system of prenatal screening capable of identifying many complications before symptoms became severe. A woman might simply endure discomfort and assume that it was part of pregnancy, and in many cases it was. Pregnancy itself is a remarkable physical process. The uterus expands dramatically. The cardiovascular system adapts. Blood volume increases. Hormonal changes affect almost every major system of the body. The growing fetus requires oxygen and nutrients, and the mother's body adjusts to support that developing life. Today, many of these changes can be monitored. In the 19th century, much of what happened inside the womb remained hidden. A doctor could examine the woman's abdomen. He could listen to the fetal heartbeat using developing forms of obstetric technology later in the century. He could ask questions about symptoms. He could sometimes estimate the position of the fetus through physical examination. But there was no image on a screen showing the baby moving. There was no routine blood test giving physicians a detailed picture of maternal health. There was no electronic fetal monitor continuously displaying the baby's heart rate. There was simply the woman, the people around her, and the medical knowledge available at that particular moment. That uncertainty could be difficult. A woman might notice something that frightened her, but have no clear way to know whether it was harmless. Pain could be difficult to interpret. Bleeding during pregnancy could have different causes, some minor and some serious. Severe swelling might be dismissed as one of the ordinary discomforts of pregnancy, even though certain forms of swelling could be associated with dangerous conditions. Headaches, visual disturbances, convulsions, and other symptoms could become particularly serious in pregnancies complicated by preeclampsia or eclampsia, conditions whose causes and mechanisms were not understood as they are today. A 19th century physician could recognize that something was wrong without necessarily knowing why it was happening. That distinction is important. Medical history is not simply a story of doctors knowing nothing. Physicians and midwives observed pregnancy closely. They accumulated practical experience. They learned from generations of births. They recorded cases. They debated techniques. They improved instruments. They argued over the best ways to respond to difficult labor. But knowledge was incomplete, unevenly distributed, and often mixed with ideas that would later be discarded. Midwives, in particular, possessed extensive practical knowledge. In many communities, childbirth was not primarily a hospital event. It took place at home, surrounded by women who had experience with pregnancy and birth. A midwife might recognize the stages of labor through sounds, movements, breathing, and physical signs. She might know how to position a woman, how to encourage rest, and when a labor seemed unusual. Her knowledge was often experiential rather than based on laboratory science, and yet experience could be extremely valuable. A woman who had attended many births could notice patterns that were not easily captured in books. She might know when a labor was progressing normally and when something seemed wrong. But even the most experienced midwife faced limits that modern medicine has gradually reduced. If a woman's pelvis was too small for the baby's passage, there was little that could be done safely. If the baby was positioned in a difficult way, options were limited. If severe bleeding began after birth, the situation could deteriorate quickly. If infection developed, there were no antibiotics. If a woman lost a dangerous amount of blood, modern transfusion medicine was not available. These were not simply problems of knowledge. They were problems of technology, biology, transportation, communication, and time. A doctor could not always reach a woman quickly. A rural family might live many miles from a physician. Roads could become muddy after rain. Snow could make travel difficult. A horse and carriage moved at the speed of the road and the weather. There were no ambulances waiting outside homes. There was no emergency telephone call connecting a household instantly to a hospital. Sometimes the distance between a woman's home and medical assistance could become part of the medical problem itself. And then there was nutrition. The 19th century experienced enormous differences in food availability. Some households had access to varied diets containing meat, dairy products, grains, vegetables, and fruit. Others lived with chronic poverty and seasonal shortages. For poor women, pregnancy could occur while food was already scarce. A pregnant woman might need additional nutrients while having little control over what the household could afford. Modern knowledge about vitamins and minerals developed gradually. The scientific understanding of nutritional deficiencies was still emerging during the 19th century. Iron deficiency anemia, for example, could occur during pregnancy and cause weakness and fatigue. Today, iron supplementation and blood testing can help identify and manage anemia. For a 19th century woman, persistent tiredness might simply be accepted as part of pregnancy, poverty, heavy work, or family life. She might wake exhausted and still have a full day ahead. Imagine carrying water in the early morning while pregnant. The vessel is heavy. The path may be uneven. Your body is already using energy to support a growing fetus. Yet the household still needs water. You return home. The fire needs attention. Breakfast needs to be prepared. Perhaps there are children to dress. Perhaps clothing must be washed by hand. Perhaps there is work waiting outside. For a woman without servants, pregnancy did not necessarily reduce the amount of work expected from her. Sometimes relatives helped. Sometimes husbands helped. Sometimes neighbors offered assistance. But support depended heavily on circumstances. The romantic image of pregnancy as a quiet period of rest would not describe many working-class women. Their lives were often physically demanding whether they were pregnant or not. Industrialization created another setting. During the 19th century, factories expanded in many parts of Europe and North America. Women worked in textile mills, garment production, domestic service, agriculture, food processing, and other forms of employment. Working conditions varied greatly. Some jobs required long hours of standing. Others involved repetitive movements. Some workplaces were hot, noisy, dusty, or poorly ventilated. A pregnant worker might continue working because stopping could mean losing income. Maternity leave, as we understand it today, was not a universal protection. Employment depended on local laws, employers, household economics, and social class. A woman could therefore experience pregnancy while worrying not only about her body, but also about wages. If she stopped working, who would provide food? Who would pay the rent? Who would care for the children? Who would replace her income? These questions could make physical discomfort feel even heavier. As the months passed, pregnancy became harder to conceal. A growing abdomen announced what the woman might already have known for a long time. In some communities, pregnancy was surrounded by strong social expectations. Marriage and childbirth were closely connected in many societies, though premarital pregnancy certainly occurred. A married woman might be expected to bear children. A woman who did not conceive could face pressure or suspicion. The 19th century had strong cultural ideas about motherhood, femininity, and family life. Women were often judged according to expectations that placed domestic responsibilities at the center of their lives. Yet real women's experiences were more complicated than those ideals suggested. Some women welcomed pregnancy. Some feared it. Some experienced both feelings at once. A woman could love the child she expected and still be frightened by the physical risks of childbirth. She could be happy about becoming a mother and exhausted by pregnancy. She could look forward to the baby while quietly wondering whether she herself would survive the birth. That uncertainty was not irrational. Maternal mortality was a serious problem in the 19th century. The exact rates varied greatly by place and period, and historical records are incomplete. But childbirth could become dangerous because of hemorrhage, infection, obstructed labor, hypertensive disorders, and other complications. And the risks did not end when the baby was born. The days afterward could be critical. A woman might initially appear well and then develop fever or other symptoms. Before the acceptance of germ theory and effective infection control, physicians and birth attendants did not always understand how infections were transmitted. One of the most important changes in 19th century medicine came through a growing recognition that invisible organisms could cause disease. The work of scientists such as Louis Pasteur helped establish the germ theory of disease. Joseph Lister applied antiseptic principles to surgery. These developments gradually changed medical practice, but understanding did not instantly transform every birth room. Practices varied, hospitals varied, doctors varied, Midwives varied. The transition took decades. In some settings, childbirth became safer as attention to cleanliness and infection control improved. In others, old practices continued. This unevenness is one reason the 19th century cannot be described with a single picture. A woman giving birth in 1810 and another giving birth in 1890 both lived in the 19th century, but the medical world surrounding them could be very different. The same was true across geography. A woman in London, Paris, Boston, Vienna, a small English village, or a rural settlement in North America might encounter very different forms of care. Some places had hospitals with specialized maternity wards. Others relied almost entirely on home birth. And even when hospitals existed, many women preferred or were expected to give birth at home. Home offered familiar surroundings. Relatives could be nearby. A midwife could attend. The woman did not have to travel while in labor, but home also meant that emergency resources were limited. If something went seriously wrong, the people present had only the knowledge and equipment they had brought with them. Picture yourself in the final weeks of pregnancy. The house is familiar. You know the sound of the floorboards. You know where the cooking utensils are kept. You know how the evening light falls across the room. Yet your body feels increasingly unfamiliar. The baby moves inside you. Sometimes the movement is gentle. Sometimes it is strong enough to interrupt whatever you are doing. There is something reassuring about feeling the baby move. But there can also be a strange awareness that another life is growing inside your body, following its own rhythm. In the 19th century, women learned to understand these movements through experience. A mother might recognize her baby's patterns. She might speak about them with another woman who had been pregnant before. Pregnancy knowledge was often shared informally. Older women could offer advice. Mothers, sisters, aunts, neighbors, and midwives could become sources of information. Some advice was practical. Some reflected traditional beliefs. Some was inaccurate. Some was shaped by local customs. Pregnancy existed at the intersection of medicine, family experience, religion, folklore, and social expectation. This mixture could be comforting. It could also create confusion. Women were often told what foods to eat or avoid, how much activity was appropriate, how they should behave, and what signs were supposed to predict the baby's sex or health. Many such beliefs had little scientific foundation. Yet it is important not to imagine 19th century women as passive recipients of every belief. Women made decisions. They observed their bodies. They exchanged knowledge. They questioned advice. They developed their own understanding of what pregnancy felt like. And many women possessed considerable practical knowledge about childbirth. Still, one of the greatest difficulties was that serious complications could sometimes begin subtly. Modern medicine relies heavily on measurement. Blood pressure can be checked. Blood tests can reveal anemia or infection. Urine can be tested for signs of certain problems. Ultrasound can examine fetal growth and position. Modern imaging can reveal internal conditions that earlier physicians could only guess at. In the 19th century, many of these measurements did not exist. A physician's hands, ears, eyes, and questions were the primary tools. A woman herself was another essential source of information. She knew what she felt. She knew when something was different. but symptoms could be difficult to interpret. Pregnancy created discomfort even when everything was going normally. That meant normal discomfort and dangerous symptoms could sometimes overlap. Pain did not always mean disaster, and the absence of pain did not guarantee safety. This uncertainty could make pregnancy psychologically difficult as well as physically demanding. There was another reality that modern people sometimes forget. Pregnancy could happen again and again. In societies where effective contraception was limited or inaccessible, married women could experience repeated pregnancies throughout their reproductive years. A woman might become pregnant while still caring for an infant. She might be nursing one child while carrying another. Her body could therefore move repeatedly through pregnancy, childbirth, recovery, and breastfeeding. The spacing between births varied. Some women experienced several years between pregnancies. Others had children much closer together. Family size depended on many factors, including breastfeeding, fertility, marital patterns, contraception, illness, and infant survival. But large families were common in many 19th century societies. This meant that pregnancy was not necessarily a single extraordinary event. It could be a recurring part of adult life, and repeated pregnancy placed repeated demands on the body. Each pregnancy could be different. One might be relatively easy. Another might involve severe vomiting. Another might end in miscarriage. Another might progress normally until labor suddenly became difficult. Women also experienced pregnancy loss. Miscarriage was not rare, though historical records often undercount early losses because they might occur before a pregnancy was recognized or formally recorded. A woman who lost a pregnancy could face physical pain as well as grief. There were few modern medical explanations available to her. She might blame herself. Others might blame her. She might hear explanations based on moral beliefs, physical activity, emotional distress, or supernatural ideas. But in many cases, the true cause was simply unknown. Today we understand that many miscarriages occur because of chromosomal abnormalities that prevent normal development. 19th century women did not have access to that knowledge. They often had to live with uncertainty, and uncertainty could follow them through future pregnancies. A woman who had previously lost a baby might approach the next pregnancy with quiet fear. Every pain could seem significant. Every unusual sensation could bring back the memory of the earlier loss. The emotional world of pregnancy, therefore, mattered just as much as the physical one. Yet 19th century culture did not always encourage women to speak openly about fear. Women were often expected to be patient. They were expected to endure discomfort. They were expected to fulfill domestic duties. The ideal of the self-sacrificing mother could make suffering seem like something that simply had to be accepted. This did not mean women felt no fear. It meant that fear was often carried quietly. As the pregnancy progressed, clothing could become another practical problem. Women's clothing in the 19th century was shaped by fashion, class, and region. Loose garments and adjustable clothing existed, and pregnant women adapted their wardrobes in many ways. But fashionable dress could sometimes be restrictive. Corsets were widely worn during parts of the 19th century, although their use varied by class, period, and individual preference. The popular image of every pregnant woman tightly laced into a corset is too simple. Pregnant women adapted garments. Some loosened or stopped wearing corsets. Others continued wearing supportive garments in modified ways. Nevertheless, changing body shape within a clothing culture that valued a particular silhouette could be uncomfortable. A woman's pregnancy was increasingly visible, and visibility carried social meaning. Pregnancy was generally considered a private subject, especially in polite society. Women could be expected to conceal their condition for as long as possible. This created an interesting contradiction. Pregnancy was central to family life, yet discussions about the pregnant body could be surrounded by modesty and silence. Women had to learn about their bodies without the open medical education that is more common today. Formal sex education was limited. Medical information existed in books, but access to those books depended on literacy, money, education, and social circumstances. Much knowledge traveled through conversation. A young woman approaching her first pregnancy might learn from her mother or another experienced woman. She might have no detailed understanding of what labor would feel like until she experienced it herself. The first contractions could therefore be confusing. Was this the beginning? Was it false labor? Was the pain normal? How long would it last? When should the midwife be called? These questions were answered through experience and local custom. And then, eventually, the waiting ended. Labor began. The body that had spent months changing entered another stage. The first contractions might be mild and irregular. The woman could continue moving around the house. She might eat if she could. She might rest between contractions. The people around her would begin preparing. Water might be heated. Cloths gathered. The birth room made ready. A midwife or physician might be summoned. Outside, ordinary life continued. A street remained noisy. A market opened. Rain fell against the windows. A horse passed along the road. But inside the room, time seemed different. The woman waited through each contraction. The intervals might shorten. The pain might become stronger. Her attention narrowed. The experience of labor itself has changed surprisingly little across centuries. The basic work is still done by the same human body. The uterus contracts. The cervix gradually opens. The baby moves through the birth canal. The mother uses her strength. The process can take hours. Sometimes it takes much longer. Sometimes it progresses quickly. No two births are exactly alike. But 19th century women faced these ancient physical demands without many of the tools that modern obstetrics would later provide. Pain relief existed in limited forms. Opium preparations had long been used medicinally. Ether and chloroform anesthesia became increasingly important during the 19th century, particularly in surgery and eventually in obstetrics. The famous use of chloroform in childbirth by Queen Victoria in 1853 helped make obstetric anesthesia more socially acceptable among some women of her class. But anesthesia was not universally available or universally accepted. Doctors debated its safety. Religious and cultural objections existed. Access depended on location, money, medical practice, and the period in which a woman gave birth. Even when pain relief was available, it did not eliminate the underlying risks of labor. a woman could be unconscious or less aware of pain while still facing hemorrhage, obstructed labor, infection, or other complications. The development of anesthesia therefore solved one problem while leaving many others. And then there was the question of intervention. Modern obstetric medicine has many ways to assist a difficult birth. 19th century physicians had fewer options. Forceps had existed since the 17th century, but their use was surrounded by debate, secrecy in earlier periods, and considerable variation in technique. Used appropriately by an experienced practitioner, forceps could sometimes help deliver a baby when labor was difficult. But they could also cause serious injuries when used improperly. Caesarean section existed, but for much of the 19th century, it remained a highly dangerous operation. Without modern anesthesia, antisepsis, surgical technique, antibiotics, and blood transfusion, opening the abdomen carried enormous risks. A caesarean operation was therefore not simply an alternative chosen casually when labor became difficult. It was a major and often dangerous procedure. In some circumstances, the decision to operate came only when the situation was already desperate. This is one reason the 19th century contains so many stories of women enduring extraordinarily difficult labors. But there is no need to imagine every birth as a catastrophe. Many women gave birth safely. Many pregnancies ended with healthy mothers and healthy babies. That fact is just as important. If every 19th century birth had been disastrous, families and communities could not have continued. Women developed practical strategies. Midwives gained experience. Physicians improved their knowledge. Families provided support. Most births eventually ended without the worst possible outcome. The problem was that when a dangerous complication occurred, the available response could be limited. That difference between ordinary birth and dangerous birth is at the heart of 19th century maternal history. A normal labor could remain normal. A difficult labor could become dangerous. And there was not always a reliable way to bring the two back together. As the morning slowly arrives, the 19th century house begins to wake. The woman is still in labor. The room is warm from the fire. Someone moves quietly nearby. A basin of water sits within reach. The midwife watches carefully. The woman breathes through another contraction. Outside, the ordinary world has not stopped. But for her, everything has narrowed to the next moment. Soon, she will meet the child she has carried for months. But before that moment comes, her body still has work to do. And after the birth, another chapter of 19th century motherhood will begin. Because pregnancy was never only the 9 months before a baby arrived. It was a journey through work, uncertainty, changing bodies, family expectations, medical limitations, and the quiet resilience of women who had to navigate all of them. And to understand how hard that journey could be, we must stay with her a little longer, beyond the moment of birth, into the fragile days when the room grows quiet again, and everyone begins to wonder whether mother and child will truly be all right. The room becomes quieter after the birth. For a moment, there may be little more than breathing, the soft movements of the people nearby, and the faint sounds of the household continuing beyond the door. The child has arrived. But for the mother, the journey is not finished. In the 19th century, people understood that the birth itself was only one part of the process. A woman still had to deliver the placenta, recover from the physical strain of labor, and begin caring for a newborn. Sometimes, everything proceeded normally. Sometimes, the most dangerous part was only beginning. Imagine lying still after several hours of labor. Your body feels exhausted. Your muscles ache. Your clothing and bedding may be damp with sweat. The room smells of warm water, linen, smoke, and the familiar sense of the household. Someone may be holding the newborn nearby. Perhaps the baby makes a small sound. Perhaps there is a moment of relief. But the women attending the mother are still watching her closely. One of the major dangers after childbirth was hemorrhage. Some bleeding after delivery is a normal part of the body's adjustment. The uterus contracts after the placenta separates, helping reduce blood loss. But if the uterus failed to contract properly, or if pieces of the placenta remained inside, bleeding could become severe. Modern obstetrics has medications, intravenous fluids, blood products, surgical procedures, and other interventions for postpartum hemorrhage. A 19th century birth attendant had far fewer resources. There were practical methods for trying to control bleeding, including uterine massage and other interventions known through experience. But if blood loss became extreme, there was no modern blood bank waiting nearby. There was no reliable system for replacing the lost blood. A woman could become pale and weak. Her pulse could become faint. She might lose consciousness, and the people around her could be forced to watch while their options narrowed. This is one of the most difficult aspects of historical childbirth. The danger was not always visible at first. A woman might appear tired, but stable. Then, within a short time, her condition could change. For the family, there might be confusion. Someone might run for the doctor. Someone else might heat more water. The midwife might continue working. A husband might stand helplessly nearby. In a rural community, the nearest physician might still be far away. Minutes mattered, but transportation was slow. And while the 19th century eventually developed railways and better roads, many births still took place in homes far from medical centers. Even when a doctor arrived, his tools were limited by the medical knowledge of his time. The second major danger was infection. For centuries, women had developed fever after childbirth. The condition that later became known as puerperal fever could spread rapidly and kill otherwise healthy women. The causes were not fully understood for much of the 19th century. This was a devastating problem because infection could be carried into the birth room by people who believed they were helping. A physician might examine one patient and then another. A midwife might attend several women. Hands and instruments could move from one patient to another without adequate cleaning. At a time before modern germ theory became widely accepted, the connection between invisible microorganisms and disease was not obvious. People proposed many explanations. Some blamed bad air. Others spoke of atmospheric conditions, contaminated environments, or disturbances within the body. The old idea of miasma, the belief that disease could arise from poisonous or unhealthy air, remained influential. It was not irrational in every detail. Dirty environments really could be associated with disease. But the mechanism was misunderstood. the microscopic world remained largely invisible to ordinary medical practice. Then, during the 19th century, a gradual transformation began. Scientists increasingly demonstrated that microorganisms could cause disease and decay. Pasteur's work became particularly influential. Other researchers and physicians built on these discoveries. The implications for childbirth were profound. If infection could be transmitted by contaminated hands and instruments, then cleanliness was no longer simply a matter of comfort. It became a matter of life and death. One physician who became especially important in this history was Ignaz Semmelweis. Working in Vienna in the 1840s, he noticed that women giving birth in a clinic staffed by physicians and medical students were dying from puerperal fever at much higher rates than women in a midwife-run clinic. He proposed that doctors were carrying infectious material from autopsies to women in labor. He introduced hand washing with chlorinated lime solutions and observed a dramatic decline in deaths. Yet his ideas were not immediately accepted. This is an important lesson from medical history. Evidence does not always lead instantly to agreement. People interpret evidence through the theories they already believe. Semmelweis's explanation challenged established medical thinking. He struggled to persuade many colleagues. Only later did the growing acceptance of germ theory provide a stronger framework for understanding why hand hygiene mattered. By the later 19th century, antiseptic and aseptic practices increasingly transformed hospitals and surgery. But the transition was gradual. A woman giving birth in one place could receive very different care from another woman giving birth elsewhere. The date also mattered. A birth in the early 19th century occurred in a very different medical environment from a birth near 1900. The story of childbirth therefore follows the larger transformation of medicine itself. At the beginning of the century, physicians had limited understanding of microorganisms. By the end, the germ theory of disease had become a foundation of modern medicine. That transformation changed the birth room. But before we move further into the century, it is worth returning to the woman herself. After childbirth, she needed rest. Yet rest was not always easy. Her body had undergone enormous physical changes. The uterus had to contract back toward its pre-pregnancy size. The abdominal muscles and pelvic structures had been stretched. The breasts began preparing for lactation. Hormonal changes affected her emotions and physical state. She had lost blood. She had spent hours using muscles intensely. She might have tears or other injuries from delivery. And she was now expected to care for a newborn. There was no modern maternity ward where a trained team could routinely monitor her vital signs around the clock. Home care depended on family, servants, neighbors, midwives, and local customs. A wealthy woman might have had several people available to help. A poor woman might have had little assistance. Imagine a mother resting on a bed while another woman wraps the newborn. The baby is tiny. The mother listens. The household smells different now. There is the smell of warm milk, fresh linen, wood smoke, perhaps boiled water, perhaps food being prepared for the mother. The room is calm, but the new mother may already be thinking about what comes next: feeding the baby, sleeping, healing, and eventually returning to the work of the household. Breastfeeding was common in many 19th century communities, although practices varied by class and region. For poorer women, breastfeeding could be closely tied to infant survival. For wealthy women, wet nurses were sometimes employed. The use of a wet nurse was particularly common in some upper-class and urban settings. A wet nurse was another woman who breastfed an infant, often because the baby's mother did not nurse herself. This created an interesting social relationship. The milk came from another woman's body. Her own child might be affected by the arrangement. In some cases, wet nurses left their own infants with relatives or caregivers while nursing another family's child. So even something as intimate as feeding a baby could reflect the inequalities of 19th century society. For women who breastfed their own children, feeding could be exhausting. Newborn babies needed frequent feeding. There were no formula bottles designed according to modern nutritional science. Artificial feeding existed, but it could be dangerous when preparation and sanitation were poor. Contaminated milk or water could transmit disease. Bottles were difficult to clean thoroughly. Infant feeding practices therefore mattered greatly to survival. Breast milk could provide important protection against some infections, but breastfeeding itself was not always easy. A mother might experience painful nipples, breast inflammation, or difficulty with milk production. There were no lactation consultants in the modern sense. Advice came from experienced women, midwives, physicians, or family traditions. Sometimes that advice helped. Sometimes it did not. The mother also had to recover while sleeping in fragments. A newborn's cries could wake the household repeatedly. Night became a series of short periods of rest. The 19th century night was already different from ours. In many homes, artificial lighting was limited. Candles, oil lamps, and later gas lighting provided illumination. A mother awake at 2 a.m. might sit in a dim room with a small flame nearby. The rest of the house could be almost completely dark. There was no electric lamp at the bedside in most homes, no baby monitor, no modern crib with standardized safety design, no disposable diapers. Cloth had to be washed, water had to be heated. Everything required physical effort, and the mother was still recovering. This is where the experience of pregnancy and childbirth connects to another major reality of 19th century life. Infant mortality was high in many 19th century societies. A woman could survive pregnancy and childbirth and still lose her baby. The emotional burden was enormous. Today, parents often have access to medical explanations, monitoring, neonatal care, antibiotics, and specialized pediatric treatment. 19th century parents had far fewer options. Newborns could die from infections, respiratory problems, prematurity, feeding difficulties, congenital conditions, and other causes. Some deaths happened within hours. Others came after days or weeks. A mother might spend months carrying a child inside her body, survive labor, and then watch helplessly as the infant became ill. The historical record often preserves these losses imperfectly. Families experience them deeply, even when official statistics recorded only a small part of the story. A graveyard might contain many small stones. A family Bible might contain a short line recording a child's birth and death. A church register might list a baby who lived only a few days. For the mother, those few days could still contain an entire world of attachment. This is another reason 19th century motherhood could be emotionally difficult. The possibility of loss was close. People understood that babies sometimes died. They knew that childhood illnesses could become serious. They might have witnessed siblings, neighbors, or previous children die. Yet knowing that something was common did not make it painless. A mother could grieve intensely. She could also be expected to continue. The household still needed food. Other children still needed care. Work still had to be done. Life rarely paused for grief. This expectation could be especially difficult for women with large families. A woman might have several living children and several who had died. Her emotional life could contain joy and sorrow at the same time. She could love the child sleeping beside her while remembering another child buried years earlier. These experiences were part of family life in many 19th century communities. And then there was the physical repetition of pregnancy. Imagine a woman who has just recovered from childbirth. Months pass. The baby grows. The mother returns to household work. She carries water again. She washes clothing. She prepares food. She tends the garden. She cares for older children. Perhaps she begins menstruating again. Perhaps she does not, especially if breastfeeding continues. Eventually, another pregnancy may begin. The cycle starts again. This repeated physical demand could shape a woman's entire adult life. In some families, children arrived every couple of years. In others, intervals were longer. There was no universal pattern. But fertility could remain central to a married woman's life, and contraception was much less reliable and accessible than modern methods. People did attempt to prevent pregnancy. Methods included abstinence, withdrawal, condoms made from animal membranes or other materials, various pessaries, and preparations intended to act as contraceptives. Knowledge of contraception existed, but effectiveness varied widely. Some methods were unreliable. Some could be dangerous. Access depended on money, knowledge, cultural attitudes, and availability. So for many women, controlling the timing and number of pregnancies was difficult. This matters because the hardship of pregnancy cannot be separated from reproductive control. A woman who became pregnant repeatedly was not necessarily choosing that pattern. Her options were shaped by biology and society. Marriage could mean a long period during which pregnancy remained possible. And every pregnancy carried some level of physical risk. The risk of maternal death was not identical in every place or every decade. Improving hygiene, better medical understanding, professional training, and later improvements in surgical and obstetric care gradually changed outcomes. But the 19th century remained a period in which childbirth could still be dangerous. A woman could understand this from experience. She might have watched her sister die. She might have lost a friend. She might have heard stories from older women. The knowledge could sit quietly in her mind throughout pregnancy. Perhaps she did not speak about it. Perhaps she did. But the possibility was there. And yet, women continued to have children. They built families. They cared for infants. They worked. They laughed. They celebrated births. They prepared small clothes. They chose names. They sang to babies. They complained about sleepless nights. They learned the particular expressions of their children. Historical hardship should never erase ordinary happiness. A 19th-century mother could experience deep tenderness. She could enjoy the warmth of a baby sleeping against her. She could watch a child take its first steps. She could feel relief when a fever passed. She could hear children laughing in the yard. The world was difficult, but it was also full of ordinary affection. As the child grows, the mother's attention slowly moves beyond the birth itself. The baby becomes part of the household, and the mother begins the long work of keeping that small person alive. This work was often invisible. It involved feeding, cleaning, washing, watching, waiting. A mother learned to distinguish different cries. She knew when the baby was hungry. She noticed changes in breathing. She felt the child's forehead. She watched the skin. She listened during the night. Without modern medical equipment, parents often relied heavily on observation. Sometimes observation was enough. Sometimes it was not. A baby with a serious infection might simply become quiet. A child who could not feed might weaken quickly. A fever might rise. There were physicians and medicines, of course. 19th-century medicine included numerous treatments. But many treatments were ineffective, and some were harmful. Medical practice was changing rapidly, yet effective treatment for many infectious diseases remained unavailable. Antibiotics would not become part of routine medicine until the 20th century. This meant that prevention and basic care were extraordinarily important. Clean water mattered. Safe food mattered. Ventilation mattered. Hand washing mattered. But people did not always understand these connections scientifically. The development of public health gradually changed the environment in which mothers raised children. Clean water systems expanded. Sewage systems improved. Urban sanitation became a major concern. Public health authorities increasingly recognized the importance of controlling infectious disease. These changes did not happen everywhere at the same speed. But by the end of the 19th century, the foundations of modern public health were becoming more visible. And this brings us back to pregnancy. Because the difficulty of 19th century pregnancy was not caused by one single thing. It was a combination. The physical demands of pregnancy were ancient. The risks of childbirth were partly biological, but the severity of those risks was influenced by medicine, nutrition, sanitation, poverty, transportation, working conditions, social expectations, and reproductive control. A woman living in comfort, surrounded by skilled care, could experience pregnancy very differently from a poor woman working long hours while caring for several children. A woman in a city hospital could have options unavailable to a woman in a remote village. A woman giving birth near the end of the century could benefit from medical developments that were unknown at its beginning. History becomes clearer when we remember these differences. There was no single 19th century woman. There were millions of women. Each lived inside her own household, community, economy, and body. Some had relatively easy pregnancies. Some experienced severe illness. Some died. Some survived repeated pregnancies without major complications. Some lost children. Some never became mothers. Some chose not to marry. Some could not marry. Some worked throughout pregnancy. Some had servants. Some gave birth surrounded by experienced women. Others faced childbirth with very little support. And through all these differences, pregnancy remained one of the most physically demanding experiences a human body can undergo. The 19th century did not create the difficulty of pregnancy. It created a particular environment in which that difficulty was managed, sometimes skillfully, sometimes poorly, sometimes with remarkable courage, and sometimes with no effective answer at all. Picture yourself once more in that quiet 19th century room. The baby is sleeping now. The mother has finally closed her eyes. A small candle burns nearby. The flame moves slightly whenever air enters through a gap in the window. Outside, the street is quiet. The night air carries the smell of damp earth. Somewhere far away, a carriage passes. The mother does not know what medicine will look like 50 years from now. She does not know about antibiotics. She does not know about ultrasound. She does not know that one day doctors will be able to watch a fetus developing inside the womb. She knows only her own body. She knows the child beside her. And she knows that tomorrow there will be work waiting. For now, however, there is a small moment of peace. The difficult months of pregnancy are behind her. The long hours of labor have passed. The baby is breathing. She is alive. And in the quiet darkness, that may be enough. But the 19th century still has another story to tell. Because as medicine slowly changed, childbirth itself began to move from the familiar rooms of homes toward hospitals, medical schools, and increasingly professional systems of care. The old world of experienced midwives would begin to meet a new world of obstetric science. And that transition would bring its own complications, its own discoveries, and its own unexpected consequences. The 19th century is now moving forward, slowly but steadily. The woman who gave birth at home is still part of a familiar world, but around her, medicine is beginning to change. Doctors are learning more, hospitals are becoming more organized, medical schools are expanding, surgical instruments are improving, scientific ideas are beginning to challenge older explanations of disease. Yet progress does not arrive like sunrise all at once. It comes gradually. One town may have a new hospital, while another still depends almost entirely on home care. One physician may wash his hands carefully, while another sees no reason to do so. One family may have access to a trained midwife, while another relies on an older woman in the neighborhood who has learned childbirth through years of experience. Pregnancy remains the same ancient physical journey, but the world surrounding it is beginning to change. Imagine walking through a 19th century city in the early morning. The streets are damp. Horses move slowly over uneven roads. Smoke rises from chimneys. Shopkeepers begin opening their doors. Workers walk toward factories. And somewhere among these streets, women are entering hospitals for treatment that previous generations would have found unfamiliar. Hospitals themselves had complicated reputations. They were places where doctors could observe large numbers of patients and develop medical knowledge. But they could also be places where infection spread easily. Crowded wards could contain many sick people. Ventilation could be poor. Cleanliness varied. Medical students moved between patients. In some hospitals, maternity wards became places where doctors could study childbirth systematically. This had advantages. Doctors could compare cases. They could observe difficult labors. They could teach students. They could develop specialized obstetric knowledge. But there was also a serious problem. The concentration of sick patients could create an environment where infection spread. This was especially important before germ theory and modern infection control became established. A hospital was not automatically safer simply because it was a hospital. For some women, home could actually be the more familiar and sometimes safer environment. The balance began to change only as medical knowledge and hospital practices improved. One of the most important developments was the increasing professionalization of obstetrics. Obstetrics had existed as a field of medical practice for centuries, but during the 19th century, physicians increasingly claimed specialized authority over pregnancy and childbirth. Medical schools taught obstetrics. Hospitals created maternity services. Obstetric instruments became more sophisticated. Physicians published observations. Birth gradually became something that could be studied systematically. This brought genuine benefits, but it also changed the relationship between women and traditional birth attendants. Midwives had long been central to childbirth in many communities. Their knowledge was practical. They understood the rhythm of labor. They knew how to support women through ordinary births. They often worked within networks of female relatives and neighbors. As medical institutions expanded, physicians increasingly argued that childbirth should be managed by trained medical professionals. The balance between midwives and physicians varied enormously from country to country. In some places, midwifery remained strong. In others, doctors gained increasing influence. The shift was not simply about science, it was also about professional status, education, law, gender, class, and institutional power. Male physicians were entering a field that had long been dominated by women. That created tensions. A physician could bring knowledge of anatomy, surgery, and medical theory. A midwife brought practical experience, accumulated through attending many births. The two forms of knowledge did not always fit neatly together. Some doctors dismissed midwives as uneducated. Some midwives distrusted physicians, and some communities used both. A woman might begin labor with a midwife and call a physician only if something went wrong. This arrangement could work well when the two professionals cooperated, but cooperation was not guaranteed. Meanwhile, the growing medical interest in childbirth created another important change. Doctors began to record births in greater detail. They measured, they counted, they compared, they classified. They tried to determine how long labor should last. They studied fetal positions. They developed theories about pelvic anatomy. They refined forceps. They debated when instruments should be used. They studied the placenta. They examined complications. This growing body of knowledge helped create modern obstetrics. But the process could also feel intrusive from the perspective of the woman giving birth. Her body became an object of medical observation. Students might gather around a delivery bed. Doctors might examine her repeatedly. Procedures could be performed with limited explanation. Ideas about patient consent were very different from modern expectations. Women did not always have much authority over medical decisions. Social class mattered. A wealthy woman might have more control, because she could choose her physician. A poor woman in a teaching hospital might have far less. This was especially important in hospitals connected to medical schools. Students needed patience to learn. Hospitals therefore became centers of medical education. But the women who became teaching cases did not always receive the kind of privacy modern patients expect. The medical profession was becoming more scientific, but the idea of patient autonomy was still developing. Pregnancy could therefore involve a complicated relationship between trust and power. A woman needed help. She might fear the doctor. She might trust the midwife. She might trust both. Or she might have little choice. One of the most important changes came through anesthesia. Before the 19th century, childbirth pain was usually endured without modern anesthesia. Pain was treated in various ways, but there was no widely accepted method for making a woman unconscious or profoundly insensitive to pain during labor. Then, chemical anesthesia changed surgery. Ether was introduced into medical practice in the 1840s. Chloroform soon became another important anesthetic. These substances transformed surgical possibilities. They also entered discussions about childbirth. Queen Victoria's use of chloroform during the birth of Prince Leopold in 1853 became especially famous. Her experience helped make the idea of pain relief in childbirth more acceptable among some social groups. But anesthesia remained controversial. Some physicians worried about risks. Some people argued that labor pain had a natural or religious purpose. Others welcomed relief. The debate reflected a larger question. Should childbirth be understood as an experience that women should simply endure, or as a medical condition in which pain could legitimately be reduced? Eventually, the idea of obstetric pain relief became much more accepted. But the 19th century was still learning how to use anesthetic drugs safely. A substance that reduced awareness could also affect breathing and circulation. Dosage was not controlled with the precision available today. Monitoring was limited. So anesthesia was an important advance, but it was not without danger. And pain was not the only problem. The deeper challenge was infection. As the century progressed, more physicians began accepting the idea that invisible microorganisms were involved in disease. This changed the meaning of cleanliness. Before this transformation, a dirty instrument might be unpleasant. Afterward, it could be understood as a potential vehicle for infection. The hands of a physician became part of the equation. The instruments used during childbirth became part of the equation. The clothing worn in the delivery room became part of the equation. The water used for cleaning became part of the equation. The environment itself mattered. The birth room was no longer just a place where a baby was delivered. It was a place where invisible organisms could enter a wounded body. This new understanding gradually changed medical practice. Antiseptic techniques became more common. Surgical instruments were cleaned more carefully. Doctors began paying greater attention to hand hygiene. Sterilization methods developed. Hospitals changed their procedures. The results were profound. Operations that had once been nearly unthinkable became increasingly survivable. Cesarean section, in particular, slowly moved from an extremely dangerous last resort toward a more viable surgical procedure. The change did not happen because one person suddenly invented a perfect operation. It happened because many developments came together. Anesthesia reduced the problem of surgical pain. Antiseptic and later aseptic techniques reduced infection. Improved surgical knowledge made operations more controlled. Better understanding of anatomy helped physicians. Improved nursing contributed to patient care. And eventually, developments in blood transfusion and other supportive treatments would further transform surgery. But during much of the 19th century, these advances were incomplete. A woman requiring major abdominal surgery could still face serious danger. The possibility of infection remained. Blood loss remained a concern. Recovery could be long. Surgical decisions were not taken lightly. This was particularly important when labor became obstructed. Obstructed labor could occur for several reasons. The baby's position might be unfavorable. The baby's size might create difficulty. The mother's pelvis might not allow sufficient passage. Soft tissues could become swollen. Labor might simply fail to progress. In modern medicine, a woman experiencing obstructed labor can be transferred quickly to a facility capable of performing a cesarean section. In many 19th century settings, that option was far less available. A physician might attempt forceps. He might attempt to reposition the baby. In extreme circumstances, destructive operations were historically used to reduce the size of a fetus that could not be delivered. These procedures are difficult to imagine today, but they reflected the brutal choices physicians sometimes faced when both mother and baby were in danger and no safe surgical alternative existed. The existence of such procedures reminds us how different 19th century obstetrics could be. The goal was often not simply to preserve a healthy pregnancy. It was to save a life using whatever methods seemed possible. Sometimes those methods succeeded. Sometimes they did not. And sometimes the surviving woman carried physical injuries for the rest of her life. Another condition that could affect women after childbirth was pelvic injury. Prolonged obstructed labor could damage tissues between the birth canal and nearby organs. In severe cases, women could develop fistulas. An obstetric fistula could cause continuous leakage of urine or feces through an abnormal opening created by tissue damage. Without surgical repair, the condition could be devastating. A woman might suffer chronic physical problems. She could experience skin irritation and infection. She might be unable to control bodily functions. And because of the smell and social stigma, she could become isolated from her community. Some women with obstetric fistula were abandoned by husbands or excluded socially. The condition illustrates how a difficult birth could affect a woman's life long after the baby was born. She might survive childbirth, but never return to the life she had before. Yet 19th century medicine eventually began developing surgical repairs for such injuries. One important figure was J. Marion Sims, an American physician who became known for developing surgical techniques for vesicovaginal fistula. His work helped establish procedures that could repair injuries caused by obstructed labor. But his history is also deeply complicated because some of his experimental operations were performed on enslaved black women without consent. Remembering the medical achievement without acknowledging the suffering and lack of consent would create a misleading picture. The history of obstetrics contains both progress and injustice. New techniques sometimes saved lives. But the people on whom medical knowledge was developed did not always have control over what was done to their bodies. This is an important part of the 19th century story. Medical progress was real, but it was not always humane. And access to that progress was unequal. Race and class could strongly influence medical care. Enslaved women in the United States faced particularly harsh conditions. Pregnancy did not protect enslaved women from forced labor. They could be expected to work during pregnancy and return to labor soon after giving birth. Their reproductive lives were also controlled by slaveholders. Children born to enslaved women were generally treated under the law as enslaved property. Pregnancy therefore carried not only physical risk, but profound social and legal oppression. Enslaved women might lack control over marriage, pregnancy, labor, and the care of their own children. Their experiences must be understood separately from those of free women living under different circumstances. After emancipation, Black women still faced discrimination in medical care. Medical institutions did not provide equal treatment. Ideas about race influenced medical thinking. Some physicians falsely believed that Black people experienced pain differently or were biologically suited to harder labor. Such beliefs had no valid scientific foundation, but they could influence treatment. This is one reason the history of pregnancy cannot be reduced to a simple story of medical progress. The 19th century created new knowledge. It also carried old prejudices into new medical institutions. Women of different classes experienced pregnancy differently as well. A wealthy woman might have a private physician. She might have a nurse or servant. She might rest during late pregnancy. Her food could be prepared for her. She could recover in a private room. A factory worker or domestic servant might have no such options. She could be expected to continue working. A servant who became pregnant might face dismissal. An unmarried woman could face severe social judgment. A poor woman might have to give birth in a crowded home. So when we ask why pregnancy was so hard for 19th century women, the answer must include social conditions. The body was only part of the story. The world around the body could either make pregnancy easier or make it much harder. Consider domestic work. Modern household appliances have transformed physical labor. A 19th century woman did not simply place clothes into a washing machine. She washed them by hand. Water had to be collected. Clothing had to be scrubbed. Heavy fabric had to be lifted. It had to be wrung out. Then it had to be dried. Cooking also required physical work. Wood or coal had to be obtained. Fires had to be maintained. Food preparation could take hours. Bread might be made at home. Vegetables prepared. Meat preserved. Children supervised. Cleaning performed without modern vacuum cleaners or household plumbing. For a pregnant woman, this meant that ordinary domestic life could become physically exhausting. A modern person might look at a 19th century kitchen and see inconvenience. A pregnant woman living there might experience it as a daily physical challenge. The same applied to water. In many homes, water was not available through a tap. It had to be carried. A bucket of water was heavy even for a healthy person. For a woman in late pregnancy, carrying it could be uncomfortable or exhausting, but the family still needed water. This is why pregnancy cannot be separated from infrastructure. Clean water, sanitation, heating, transportation, and housing all influenced maternal health. Public health improvements later in the century began addressing some of these issues. Urban governments increasingly recognized that overcrowding and contaminated water could spread disease. Sewage systems improved in many cities. Clean water supplies expanded. Waste disposal became more organized. These developments were not specifically pregnancy treatments, yet they affected pregnancy and infant survival by reducing exposure to infectious disease. A healthier environment could make motherhood safer without changing the pregnancy itself. Another important development was the rise of professional nursing. Nursing had existed in many forms for centuries. Women cared for sick relatives. Religious communities maintained hospitals. Midwives provided care. But 19th century nursing increasingly became organized around formal training. Florence Nightingale became one of the best-known figures associated with this transformation. Her work during the Crimean War drew attention to sanitation, organization, ventilation, and nursing practice. Later, nursing schools helped establish systematic professional training. Hospitals gradually became places where trained nurses played a central role. This mattered for maternity care as well. Nurses could observe patients. They could monitor recovery. They could maintain cleanliness. They could help mothers after delivery. They became an important bridge between physicians and patients. Yet professional nursing also reflected the social expectations of women. Nursing was increasingly described as suitable work for women because it was associated with caregiving. This created new opportunities for some women, while also reinforcing ideas about feminine duty. The 19th century therefore expanded women's professional roles in certain areas, even as it maintained strict expectations about family life. For a pregnant woman, however, the central concern remained immediate. Will I survive? Will the baby survive? Will labor be normal? Will I bleed? Will I develop fever? Will I be able to feed my child? These questions could exist quietly beneath ordinary conversation. A woman might sit with friends and discuss clothing or food while carrying a private worry about the approaching birth. She might prepare small garments. She might fold linen. She might make arrangements for other children. The preparations could be practical rather than ceremonial. The birth was approaching, and everyone knew that uncertainty remained. As the century moved toward its final decades, medicine was becoming increasingly confident. Doctors could perform more operations. Anesthesia was more established. Antiseptic practices were gaining acceptance. Hospitals were becoming cleaner and more organized. Medical education was becoming more systematic. But confidence could sometimes become overconfidence. Doctors were gaining authority, and some interventions were used more readily. The increasing medicalization of childbirth brought benefits, but it also meant that normal birth could sometimes be treated as a medical problem requiring intervention. The balance between necessary intervention and unnecessary intervention would become an important question in later obstetric history. For 19th century women, however, the transition was still unfolding. Many still gave birth at home. Many still depended on midwives. Many had never entered a hospital. The old and new worlds existed side by side. Picture yourself in a village near the end of the century. A woman is in labor. A midwife sits beside her. The room is warm. A kettle is steaming. The windows are slightly open. Someone has sent for the doctor. Perhaps he will arrive soon. The woman breathes slowly. Her family waits outside. The baby is almost ready to enter the world. Nothing about this moment looks like modern medicine. Yet the knowledge behind the birth is already changing. The midwife may understand hygiene differently than her predecessor did. The doctor may know more about infection. The instruments may be cleaner. The community may have access to better transportation. The hospital in the nearest town may have surgical capabilities. The future is beginning to enter the room. But the woman herself remains connected to thousands of generations before her. Her body is doing the same work. Her fear is ancient. Her hope is ancient. Her exhaustion is ancient. And when the baby finally arrives, she will face the same immediate question women have faced throughout history. Is the child breathing? Is the mother safe? The 19th century slowly developed better answers to those questions. But it took decades of observation, mistakes, discoveries, arguments, and painful lessons. And perhaps the most important lesson was that pregnancy could not be made safe simply by knowing more about childbirth. Doctors also needed to understand the environment surrounding birth. They needed to understand infection. They needed to understand nutrition. They needed to understand blood loss. They needed better surgery, better nursing, better sanitation, better transportation, better communication, and eventually, better ways to monitor both mother and baby. As the century approached its final years, these pieces were beginning to connect. The birth room was becoming part of a larger medical system, yet for millions of women, pregnancy remained deeply personal and intensely physical. The medical revolution was happening around them, but they still had to live through every contraction, every night of broken sleep, every ache, every uncertainty. And when the morning finally came after a difficult birth, the woman might look through the window and see an ordinary world. The street would be there. The trees would move in the wind. A cart would pass. A neighbor might call from outside. The world would continue as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But inside the house, everything had changed. A child had entered the family. A woman had crossed one of the most demanding physical thresholds of her life, and the 19th century had taken another small step toward the medicine that would eventually make pregnancy and childbirth safer. The transformation was far from complete. There were still dangerous infections, still hemorrhage, still obstructed labor, still poverty, still discrimination, still women who could not reach medical help in time, still babies who could not be saved. But the foundations were being laid. And as we move into the final decades of the century, another question begins to emerge. What happened when all these new medical possibilities entered the birth room? Would they truly make childbirth safer? Or would the growing power of medicine create new risks of its own? The answer would unfold slowly, just as the century itself had unfolded. One discovery, one birth, and one woman at a time. By the final decades of the 19th century, the world surrounding pregnancy was beginning to look different. The old birth room had not disappeared. Women were still giving birth at home. Midwives were still attending labor. Mothers, sisters, and neighbors were still gathering around women in pain. But alongside this familiar world, another system was taking shape. Hospitals were becoming more organized. Medical education was becoming more systematic. Nurses were receiving formal training. Surgeons were learning to operate with greater care. Anesthesia was becoming more established. And the growing acceptance of germ theory was changing the way doctors thought about cleanliness. Slowly, the birth room was becoming safer. But slowly is the important word. For a woman standing at the end of the 19th century, modern obstetrics had not yet arrived in its finished form. Many of the dangers that had troubled her mother and grandmother were still present. A pregnancy could still become complicated without warning. A labor could still become obstructed. A woman could still bleed after delivery. An infection could still develop. A newborn could still become dangerously ill. And poverty could still make every one of these problems harder to survive. Imagine a young woman near the year 1900. She has grown up hearing stories about childbirth from her mother. Perhaps her mother gave birth at home. Perhaps several of her sisters were born in the same room. She knows that labor hurts. She knows that women sometimes become sick afterward. She knows that babies sometimes die. But she has also seen medicine changing. There may now be a doctor nearby. There may be a hospital within reach. There may be trained nurses. There may be cleaner instruments. There may be new treatments. The future is beginning to feel possible. And yet the woman herself still has to enter the same physical experience. Pregnancy remains demanding because the human body has not changed, simply because medical knowledge has advanced. Her heart works harder. Her blood volume rises. Her uterus expands. Her organs shift. Her joints and muscles adapt. Her sleep becomes less comfortable. Her body stores energy for breastfeeding. Her emotional world may change with the pregnancy. All of this is still happening inside her. Medicine can help manage some of it. It cannot make pregnancy effortless. This distinction is easy to overlook when looking backward. The 19th century was not difficult because women were somehow weaker. Their bodies were human bodies, just like ours. Pregnancy has always required enormous physical adaptation. What made 19th century pregnancy particularly difficult was the environment surrounding that biology. There was less reliable medical monitoring, less effective emergency treatment, less infection control in the earlier part of the century, less ability to replace blood loss, less understanding of many pregnancy complications, less control over fertility, more physical labor for many women, and often fewer choices about where, how, and with whom they would give birth. These factors could combine. One problem could make another problem worse. A woman weakened by poor nutrition might have less strength during a difficult recovery. A woman living far from medical help might lose valuable time during an emergency. A woman working throughout pregnancy might have little opportunity to rest. A woman with several young children might have no real period of recovery before another pregnancy began. A woman with limited income might not be able to choose preferred medical care. Pregnancy therefore existed inside the larger structure of 19th century life. And that structure was deeply unequal. For some women, pregnancy took place in relatively comfortable surroundings. For others, It happened alongside hunger, exhausting work, overcrowded housing, and uncertainty about the future. The difference could be enormous. Picture yourself in the home of a wealthy family. There may be several rooms. There may be servants. There may be someone available to prepare meals. The pregnant woman can rest when she is tired. If she becomes ill, a physician can be called. After childbirth, someone else can manage much of the household work. Now picture a working-class home. There may be only a few rooms. Several children may share the same space. Water must be carried. Fuel costs money. Food must be prepared. Laundry must be done. The mother may have to continue working even when her body is tired. When the baby arrives, the workload does not disappear. It increases. These two women belong to the same century. Yet their pregnancies are not the same. This is why social history matters when we talk about medicine. A medical discovery is useful only if people can reach it. A hospital cannot help a woman who cannot travel there. A physician cannot treat a woman who cannot afford the visit. A new surgical technique cannot save a patient if the necessary equipment is unavailable. Knowledge has to travel through society before it can change everyday life. And during the 19th century, that process was uneven. Urban centers often changed more quickly. Railways improved transportation. Telegraph systems improved communication. Cities developed larger hospitals. Medical journals spread new ideas. Professional organizations became more influential. But rural communities could remain distant from these developments. A woman in a remote village could still experience childbirth in ways that would have been familiar to women many generations earlier. The 19th century was therefore a bridge. Behind it was an older world of home births, traditional knowledge, and limited medical intervention. Ahead was the modern world of hospitals, laboratory science, obstetric surgery, antibiotics, blood transfusion, fetal monitoring, and advanced prenatal care. But the woman living on that bridge could not see the future. She only knew the world around her. She might not know that a few generations later, women would routinely see images of their unborn children before birth. She might not imagine that blood could be stored and transferred from one person to another. She could not know that antibiotics would eventually transform the treatment of infections. She could not know that cesarean surgery would become dramatically safer. She could not know that blood pressure measurements, laboratory tests, and ultrasound examinations would become ordinary parts of pregnancy care. She simply lived through her own pregnancy. And that is perhaps the most important way to understand history. Not as a collection of inventions, not as a list of famous doctors, but as the experience of ordinary people living before those inventions existed. Think about something as simple as a headache. Today, a pregnant woman can mention it to a healthcare professional. Her blood pressure can be checked. Her urine can be tested. Her symptoms can be evaluated. If necessary, she can be monitored more closely. A 19th century woman might have experienced a severe headache without knowing whether it was harmless or a sign of a serious pregnancy complication. If she developed seizures associated with eclampsia, the people around her might have been frightened and confused. Physicians had observations about such cases, but the underlying mechanisms were not understood in the modern way. There were treatments, but they were limited. The condition could become fatal. This uncertainty existed in many forms: bleeding, fever, severe abdominal pain, persistent vomiting, swelling, convulsions, difficulty breathing. A woman could experience symptoms that today would immediately trigger medical attention. In the 19th century, the response depended on what the people around her recognized and what resources they possessed. Sometimes they understood. Sometimes they guessed. Sometimes they waited. And sometimes there was simply nothing effective to do. This is one of the quiet tragedies of historical medicine. People could care deeply and still be unable to help. A husband could sit beside his wife all night. A mother could hold her daughter's hand. A midwife could use every technique she knew. A doctor could work desperately. And the patient could still die. The failure was not always a failure of compassion. Sometimes it was a failure of available knowledge. Sometimes it was a failure of technology. Sometimes it was a failure of social systems. And sometimes biology simply presented a problem that medicine had not yet learned to overcome. But the 19th century also contains remarkable examples of people slowly learning. They observed patterns. They challenged assumptions. They tested ideas. They made mistakes. They corrected some of them. The acceptance of hand-washing and antiseptic practices is one example. For centuries, people had washed their hands for many reasons. But understanding that invisible microorganisms could be transferred from person to person gave hygiene a new medical meaning. The birthroom became cleaner. Instruments were handled differently. Hospitals became more careful. Surgical survival improved. This was not a dramatic transformation that every woman noticed immediately. It was often simply a cleaner room, a cleaner instrument, a doctor who washed his hands, a nurse who followed a new procedure, a wound that did not become infected, a mother who survived. History sometimes changes through small habits, repeated thousands of times. The same is true of nursing. A trained nurse could observe a woman through the night. She could notice changes in temperature, breathing, bleeding, or consciousness. She could maintain cleanliness. She could provide food and fluids. She could help the mother rest. These tasks might seem ordinary, but organized nursing became an essential part of modern healthcare. The birthroom was slowly becoming a place where multiple kinds of knowledge worked together. The midwife's experience, the physician's medical training, the nurse's observation, the family's knowledge of the woman, each could contribute. At its best, this combination could save lives. Yet the transition also created conflict. As physicians gained authority, some traditional midwives lost status. In some countries, laws restricted who could legally attend births. Professional medicine increasingly defined itself against forms of care considered unscientific. Sometimes this improved standards. Sometimes it unfairly dismissed useful traditional knowledge. The history of midwifery, therefore, cannot simply be described as a story of old practices disappearing because modern medicine was better. The reality was more complicated. Midwives continued to provide important care in many places, and modern healthcare systems would later rediscover the value of skilled midwifery for uncomplicated pregnancies. The 19th century was still trying to determine where the boundaries should be. When should a birth remain a normal physiological process? When should a doctor intervene? When should instruments be used? When was surgery necessary? These questions remain important even today. But the 19th century had fewer reliable answers. The desire to intervene could sometimes create new dangers. A procedure that helped one woman might harm another. An instrument used skillfully could save a life. Used unnecessarily or incorrectly, it could cause injury. Surgery could rescue a woman in one situation and expose her to infection in another. Medicine was learning through experience, and some of that experience was painful. This is why historical medicine should be viewed with humility. People in the past were not foolish simply because they lacked modern knowledge. They were working with the evidence available to them. Some ideas were wrong. Some were partly right. Some were remarkably insightful. The difficult part is that people often could not know which was which. A physician might sincerely believe a treatment would help. A midwife might sincerely follow advice learned from her teacher. A family might sincerely believe a traditional remedy was useful. The consequences could be good, harmless, or harmful. There was no simple way to separate them. For the pregnant woman, this meant that trust was incredibly important. She had to trust someone with knowledge of a process happening inside her own body. She had to trust the people attending her. She had to trust that the advice they offered was sound. And sometimes, that trust was rewarded. Sometimes, it was not. Now imagine the final days before birth. The woman's abdomen is heavy. Her movements are slower. She may wake several times during the night. Perhaps she turns from one side to another, trying to find a comfortable position. The house is quiet. The baby moves. She places her hand gently against her abdomen. There is a strange mixture of familiarity and uncertainty. She has carried this child for months. Soon, the waiting will end. She may already have other children. Perhaps they are sleeping nearby. Perhaps one of them wakes and calls for her. Even at this stage, motherhood does not allow complete rest. A 19th century woman often remained part of the household until labor made it impossible. Then, after birth, she was expected to return to family life. There were no universal maternity protections. No guaranteed period of paid leave. No standardized recovery plan. The idea of postpartum care existed, of course. Women rested. Family members helped. Some cultures observed periods of confinement or special care after birth. But the details varied enormously. The mother eventually had to resume ordinary responsibilities. For some women, that happened relatively quickly. For others, recovery took much longer. And if there were other children, their needs continued. This is perhaps one of the quietest burdens of motherhood. The body may need rest. The household may not permit it. A mother may be exhausted. A child still needs feeding. Laundry still needs washing. Food still needs preparing. Someone still needs to clean the fire. Someone still needs to care for older children. The world does not pause because a woman has given birth. In some households, relatives or servants could absorb this work. In others, the mother carried much of it herself. The difference could affect recovery. And then there was the emotional side. The 19th century did not have modern understanding of postpartum depression, and other postpartum mental health conditions. Women could experience profound sadness, anxiety, exhaustion, or emotional disturbance after childbirth. Some cases were recognized under older concepts, such as puerperal insanity, but understanding was limited and inconsistent. A woman experiencing severe psychological symptoms might be treated as ill, morally judged, institutionalized, or simply misunderstood. Her experience could be frightening. The birth of a child was expected to bring happiness. When a mother did not feel happy, she could feel guilty. She might believe something was wrong with her character. She might hide her feelings. Again, social expectations could add another layer to physical difficulty. The 19th century ideal of motherhood was powerful. A good mother was expected to be loving, self-sacrificing, patient, and devoted. But real mothers were human. They could be tired, irritated, afraid, overwhelmed, joyful, sad, all within the same day. The ideal did not always match reality, and pregnancy had already placed enormous demands on them. So when we look back at 19th century women, it is important not to turn them into symbols of suffering. They were not simply victims of difficult childbirth. They were people living full lives. They had friendships. They had ambitions. They told jokes. They became angry. They fell in love. They argued with relatives. They cared for children. They worked. They rested when they could. They adapted. They made decisions within the limits of their circumstances. Their lives contained much more than pregnancy. But pregnancy could shape those lives profoundly. It could determine when they worked, when they rested, how many children they cared for, how much household labor they performed, how much money the family needed, and sometimes whether they survived. By the end of the 19th century, the foundations of modern maternity care were becoming clearer. The causes of infection were increasingly understood. Antiseptic and aseptic practices were spreading. Anesthesia had changed surgery and was increasingly used in obstetrics. Professional nursing was expanding. Hospitals were becoming more sophisticated. Obstetric knowledge was becoming more systematic. Medical education was improving. Public health was beginning to transform cities. But many crucial developments still lay ahead. Blood transfusion would become far more reliable in the 20th century. Antibiotics would transform infection treatment. Modern prenatal screening would develop. Ultrasound would eventually allow doctors to see the fetus before birth. Electronic fetal monitoring would provide new information during labor. Safer cesarean techniques would become routine when necessary. Rh disease would become preventable through modern medicine. Modern contraception would give women far greater control over fertility. These developments would change the experience of pregnancy profoundly. But they belong largely to another century. The 19th century woman had to live before them. And perhaps this is where the story should become quiet. Because after all the statistics, medical discoveries, and historical changes, there remains one simple human reality. A pregnant woman woke each morning and continued living. She felt the child moving. She worked. She rested. She worried. She waited. She prepared. She listened to older women. She watched the calendar. She wondered when labor would begin. And eventually, it did. The pain came. The room became busy. The hours passed. Someone held her hand. Someone heated water. Someone watched the baby. Someone waited outside. And then, at last, the child was born. Perhaps the mother survived easily. Perhaps the recovery was difficult. Perhaps there were complications. Perhaps the baby was healthy. Perhaps the baby was not. History does not give every woman the same ending. But every one of these women belonged to the same long human story. They carried children before modern hospitals. They gave birth before antibiotics. They nursed infants before modern formula. They recovered without many of the medicines we now take for granted. They faced dangers that could not always be predicted, and they did so while continuing the ordinary work of life. The 19th century, therefore, teaches us something more complicated than simply saying that pregnancy was dangerous. Pregnancy has always carried risk. What changed was humanity's ability to recognize and manage that risk. The 19th century was the period when many of the foundations for that change were being built. Some foundations were scientific. Some were technological. Some were social. Some came from the careful observations of women and midwives. Some came from physicians who challenged accepted ideas. Some came from nurses who transformed patient care. Some came from public health reforms that made entire communities healthier. And some came from painful mistakes that later generations learned not to repeat. The process was imperfect. It was unequal. It was sometimes cruel, but it moved medicine forward. As the century finally approaches its end, imagine the same quiet room once more. The fire has burned low. The newborn sleeps. The mother is exhausted. The people who helped her are beginning to leave. Perhaps the midwife gathers her things. Perhaps a nurse checks the mother one last time. Perhaps the doctor quietly writes notes about the birth. Outside, the world is changing. Electric lights are beginning to appear in cities. Telephones are connecting people across distances. Railways are carrying travelers faster than horses ever could. Factories are reshaping economies. Scientists are studying microscopic life. Hospitals are becoming modern institutions. A new century is approaching. The mother cannot see all of this future. She does not know what medicine will become. She knows only that she has survived another day. The baby breathes softly. The room is warm. For a moment, there is peace. And perhaps that is the right place to leave her. Not with a dramatic ending. Not with the idea that every 19th century pregnancy ended in tragedy, but with an understanding of how much women carried, both literally and emotionally. They carried pregnancies through long working days. They carried babies through difficult births. They carried families through illness. They carried memories of children they had lost. They carried expectations placed upon them by society, and they carried on. Their world was not simply darker than ours. It was different. Some things were harder. Some things were gentler. Some forms of knowledge were missing. Other forms of practical knowledge were deeply developed. What changed most dramatically was the ability of medicine to intervene when the natural process became dangerous. The 19th century stood near the beginning of that transformation. It was the bridge between an older world of limited intervention and the modern world of increasingly sophisticated maternity care. and every improvement had a human meaning. Cleaner hands meant fewer infections. Better surgery meant another mother might survive. Anesthesia meant less suffering. Better nursing meant closer observation. Improved sanitation meant healthier families. Better nutrition meant stronger bodies. Improved transportation meant help could arrive sooner. Scientific understanding meant that mysterious symptoms could gradually become recognizable medical conditions. These changes were built slowly, often by people whose names history barely remembers. A midwife who carefully washed her hands, a nurse who noticed a change in a patient's condition, a physician who questioned an old theory, a mother who shared what she had learned with her daughter, a public health worker who fought for cleaner water, a scientist who spent years studying organisms too small to see. History is made from these small acts. And so, when we think of the women who experienced pregnancy in the 19th century, perhaps the most fitting image is not one of fear. It is one of endurance. Imagine